we have a lot of switches and settings in our systems because they are fairly sophisticated, but that doesn't mean that they have to be complex. It just means that we can support complex questions when they come up. And everything can't be just reduced to simplicity. Some businesses have complex rules and systems, but what we can do is we can unify the various technologies that would have previously been complex in their own right and unify them.
So Neil, complexity is a fact of life. And if you look at Ray Ozzy's farewell memo to Microsoft, he talks about complexity being one of the biggest barriers to progress, particularly in the technology and in the software space. How do you address this on a daily basis, and what are you trying to achieve in reducing complexity?
Well, obviously there's lots of pieces to this. The first is trying to address complexity reduction for our customers, and unifying a lot of systems into one is a simple example of how we do that. Also, looking at something from a common use point of view is a useful way of reducing complexity. When it comes to complexity in the creation of software, my feeling is that the business is the technological part of the business is much more practical than most, and that comes from my own feelings about how software needs to be created.
And is this something that makes more sense in perhaps the software as a service world, because you're taking on the responsibility of developing the software but also running and operating it for the customer? Whereas in the traditional software world, you can't really say to your customer, okay, well, you've just rolled all of this out, and next week we're going to give you something new that you must change about it, and a month later, we're going to keep interrupting, and we're going to expect you to carry the burden of upgrading and maintaining.
In the old models, the customer bore the brunt of the coding mistakes the vendor made. In the SaaS model, the SaaS vendor bears the brunt of the coding mistakes they make. Now, because they're in charge of the infrastructure that they've deployed on, they could make a change every day. And in fact, in some cases, it's useful to make rapid changes to the code because it lowers the risk. You're changing less and less over time. Big projects where you're changing a lot and then not deploying that until it's ready means that you have to go through much more detailed analysis of your stuff.
Well, I mean, some people see it as a higher risk game to have more frequent changes, but what you're saying is it actually is a lower risk strategy to have frequent incremental changes.
Correct. If you said, well, there's a fairly broad software code base, and you provided a window of 6 months within which to make changes to the code, the number of changes you would make would be high. You may change 10% of the code in that time. And if you change 10% of that code and you have not yet deployed it to a live environment, the risk is very high that you will have conflicts, you'll have edge cases that you don't understand. But if you decided that instead of every 6 months you were going to just release a version every month, then you would be able to see fairly easily the changes that you've made in that period of time. And therefore you'd be able to target your QA more appropriately because you'd have time to do that. So if you ask our QA team what they prefer, weekly releases or monthly releases, they prefer weekly because they know exactly which changes have been made weekly. They can test those very carefully in a targeted manner, and they can get quality up. The longer the cycle, the less likely the quality will be up, which really means that you have to have an additional length of QA added to the end. So you don't end up with just a 6-month cycle, you end up with a 12-month cycle. And SaaS businesses, I don't think, can survive on that release cadence.